Welcome back, everyone. This is video 12 of the Gull Guides Featured Highlight Series, January 2026. A topic of interest for many gull enthusiasts is differentiating the various age groups in a species. And this is one of the things that makes gull watching particularly interesting, is that we have these various age groups that we can categorize and sort through. And so if you've ever given this topic much attention, you know that overall, the vast majority of individuals can be aged without a lot of trouble. But there are exceptionally this small percentage of birds that borders on being an adult, but just something not quite perfect about being an adult. That is, overall, they have these adult appearances, but with some blemishes and features that make us wonder. And so this video tackles that very topic. How do we spot these birds in the field? What features are we keying in on? And more importantly, what age group, or how do we label and categorize these individuals? For these birds, I write a little bit about this on page 18 in the guide. For these birds, we often use the qualifier adult type, or subadult, or near adult is something I've also heard in literature. So what I'm going to do is offer some insights on how we spot these birds and how we would label them. And I do want to stress here that some of this is personally my opinion and subjective, and you might encounter someone else who's skilled at aging gulls that completely disagrees. But by and large, I think most gull watchers would agree when they see an individual that doesn't quite look like a perfect adult. The question is, how do we categorize such birds and what labels do we use for such birds? So to begin, it's important for the observer to be familiar with what broad cycle grouping a gull belongs to. That is the species in question a 2-cycle, 3-cycle, or 4-cycle gull? And without this frame of reference, we really are just shooting in the dark and not going to be able to make sense of a lot of what we're seeing in the field. And so you may want to refer to table 3 on page 17 if needed. Take something like a Bonaparte's gull. It's a 2-cycle species. It's believed that we have just 2 broad age groups, first cycle and adult. It's an individual will go from first cycle, and by the end of its next molt cycle, it takes on this adult appearance. And so a second cycle Bonaparte's is essentially an adult. With 3-cycle gulls, you'll have an individual go from first cycle to second cycle, and by the end of its next molt cycle, the third molt cycle, it takes on an adult appearance. A good example of that would be ring-billed gull or short-billed gull. And I think we'll use short-billed gull in this video and a few examples with ring-billed to demonstrate 3-cycle species. Now, 4-cycle species, everybody's favorite, this is where individuals will have this additional third molt cycle. And by the end of the next molt cycle, that is the 4th molt cycle, the bird assumes this, by and large, adult-like appearance. So what we're talking about today is what of these birds that are right on the fringe here. They look like they're on the doorstep of being adults, but there's just something not quite right about them. To start with 2-cycle species, these are Bonaparte's gulls. We have obvious first cycle on the left and obvious adult on the right. There's this vague group that clearly isn't first cycle, but also has some blemishes, for lack of a better word, that doesn't quite sit right for a perfect adult. And we refer to these birds as second cycle types. Some may refer to these birds as adult types, and by and large, they are adult types. But if we look closely here, usually one of the first features that you'll notice when you're looking closely at these things are marked primary coverts. Some spotting, some streaks, just some marks that you wouldn't otherwise find on an adult. Some other features less commonly would be maybe a few streaks on the tail, or maybe a few spots on the secondary centers. Okay, these are not commonly seen from a distance, especially, unless you're looking very, very closely. So for comparison, here's a definitive adult Bonaparte's. Looks like a perfect 10, unmarked tail, unmarked primary coverts, no markings on the secondaries. I'll also point out that with most of these definitive adult Bonaparte's, P2 and P1 usually are unmarked. And so with these suspected second cycle types, if you go back and look closely at some of these birds, they'll often have some type of pigment on P2, sometimes not P1, but more commonly P2, and some down to P1. But at the same time, there could be some individuals that have unmarked P2 and unmarked P1 and still show these streaks on the primary coverts and the tail and the secondaries. And so the P1, P2 feature is just an added bonus to help kind of support your suspicion if a bird is a second cycle type. All right, so third cycle species or three cycle species, something like short-billed gull. We have these birds that go from first cycle to second cycle, and then by the end of their third molt cycle, they take on this adult appearance. But there are some individuals that show, just like with the Bonaparte's gulls, streaking on the primary coverts. They might show a little bit of markings on the tail. And for the most part, when you get into three cycle and four cycle species, what you'll notice is more pigment on the wingtip. This is a general rule. You'll notice, if short-billed gull as an adult generally doesn't show a complete band on P4, this individual for the most part does. So that might reinforce my suspicion that this is an adult type or third cycle type. Also has this smaller P9 mirror, which is kind of unusual for a definitive adult short-billed gull. So all this to say that these three individuals here, we would just simply categorize as third cycle types in the field, despite any unknown life history where they may be definitive adults that are breeding biologically. They may be 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. We really just don't know that information. But as a communication tool, seeing these features on these birds, we would call these types. Just for comparison here, here's a definitive adult type short-billed gull. Shows no blemishes on the primary coverts, the tail, just a perfect 10, if you will. So as an exercise here, let's age this bird. If you're familiar with short-billed gull, would you give this bird the second cycle category, third cycle type? Obviously not an adult. I hope nobody's saying that. There's enough going on with this bird where we wouldn't call this a third cycle type. This just looks like a pretty straightforward second cycle, maybe a little advanced for a second cycle, but it is without question showing way too many subadult features. These marked coverts, the buffy edging here and brownish wash across the wing panel, the marked tail, just irregular pattern on the wingtip here. There's nothing here to suggest that this bird is a 3-year-old. We call this a second cycle proper. All right, 4-cycle species, something like American herring gull, we said would go through 3 cycles, and then by the end of its 4th cycle is supposed to take on this definitive adult appearance. Now, many of them don't. I know of birds that I've seen in colonies on the Great Lakes, banded birds on the Atlantic that could be 5-6 years old and still show these subadult features. Again, as a communication tool, knowing that American herring is a 4-cycle species, we take something like this, a perfect-looking adult. No blemishes on the primary coverts, no markings on the tail. Notice the asymmetry in the P9 mirror here on this bird. It's kind of unusual, neat to note. There are some who feel, good friends of mine, that when you see this asymmetry, that's an indication of a young adult, a bird that hasn't stabilized yet in its primary pattern. And although this might be true, I don't think there's any data to back that up just yet. So here's a known age American herring gull. I won't tell you the age of this bird, but it is in the Gull Guide in 2062. I was very lucky to get like a full set of photos of this bird, upper wing, under wing, perched, band number. It is, in fact, a 4th cycle proper. So we don't even have to call it a type. We know this bird is a fourth cycle. What I want you to notice is the markings on the primary coverts, and also this marking on P4 here, which is really not expected in definitive adult American herrings, okay? And also there's small mirror on P10. It's a very small white mirror restricted to the inner web. And so there's maybe a lot that can be taken from this wingtip and transferred to other subadult types that we notice in the field. In the perched bird, I'd like to point out that the markings on these subadults, these near adults, these fourth cycle types, the markings on the neck are often extensive and they go down farther along the breast than in definitive adult types. You can see here the mirror on the underside of P10 is quite small. That's something I would notice in the field. And also the apicals, these white spots, although they probably have suffered from some wear, they're relatively small here. So I'll go back and look at this wingtip. It's really not that useful as they are suffering from some abrasion. But even on P8 and P9, which seem a little more intact, those are fairly small apicals for a definitive adult. And so we may say that in fourth cycle types and even younger age groups that the apicals would be significantly smaller than an adult type. All right, so if this interests you, this topic of comparing actual known age third cycles to fourth cycles, or comparing known age fourth cycles to fifth cycles, so on and so forth, I have a dedicated page to this, a wonderful example of Iceland gull on page 29. This is an example where over the course of 5 years or so, Lancey Chang in St. John's, Newfoundland, compiled and recorded this individual. He's actually recorded a number of Iceland gulls with bands. And you can see this progression from first cycle through fifth cycle and just see these subtle changes in the wingtip pattern, the bill pattern. It is quite a fascinating subject, and online you can also visit the Gull Research Organization website, where there's a lot of examples of this known age individuals that you can see maturing throughout subsequent molt cycles. All right, we have age that gull. We're going to do a exercise of about 10 or so birds and just kind of discuss how we would age these birds and what we would be noticing in the field with these birds. There's a glaucous wing gull in March, British Columbia. From a distance, most people might suspect this is an adult and not much of it after an initial view. But if you look at this pretty extensive bill band, this wash all across the wing panel, that wash is pretty noticeable if you know what a definitive adult looks like. Shouldn't have this blemished, brownish gray wash across the entire wing panel. And of course, the markings on the tail make this clearly not something we would score as a perfect 10, as a perfect adult. And so whether we call this an advanced third cycle or a fourth cycle type is very subjective. There's probably no right answer to this, but for me personally, I would call this a subadult or fourth cycle type because it's by and large so advanced. I probably would not reserve the third cycle label for a bird like this. All right, another glaucous wing type. This one has a cleaner white head, same month, less black markings on the bill, less wash across the wing panel. It looks more solidly gray across the upper wing. Whether this is a hybrid with some Western influence or not is questionable. But the markings on the tail here are probably the only thing that would really grab my attention here. So I would call this a fourth cycle type in the field. All right. Again, this is not saying that we know factually that this bird is a fourth cycle, just as a communication tool. Another glaucous wing gull, a little more black on the bill here. I do see a lot of wash across the wing panel, and that wash extends over to the outer primary coverts, even the alula here, and then of course this marbled streaking on the tail. Again, it may be an advanced third cycle for some people, for others, fourth cycle type. The point here is that this bird doesn't score perfectly in the adult category, and we would just make note of that. Sometimes this is important for ID purposes. If you're looking at a short-billed gull's wingtip or a Vega gull's wingtip, it might be important to note: is it a definitive adult? Is some of the pigment on the wingtip due to this bird's age? And so there are questions where that becomes a little more important. There's gull, Oregon, December. Notice the amount of streaking, the amount of markings coming down on the lower neck and breast here. Just something to take note of that could very well be a definitive adult. There's plenty of definitive adult types that show markings down the neck. But the tail markings here, the smudginess on the bill tip suggests maybe fourth cycle type. Okay, this is all to say it doesn't look like a perfect adult. Ring-billed gull, we know ring-billed is a 3-cycle species, so we have first cycle, second cycle, and then the subsequent age would be adult. This bird clearly does not look like an adult. I see all these markings, solid black primary coverts, markings on the marginal coverts on the leading edge here, even some streaks on the tail. The bill band actually looks thicker than a typical adult. And so there's absolutely no reason to even call this a third cycle type. I would age this bird as just a somewhat advanced second cycle Bonapartes. Second cycle ring-billed. Vega gull, February. The bill here it reeks of subadultness. But then also look at the markings on the primary coverts here. And overall, from a distance, I think most people who key in on these wingtips would notice there's some pretty irregular black markings on the inner webs here of these feathers on P7, P6, and even P5. And so these markings are very likely age-related. And so I think with a bird like this, it is very safe to call a fourth cycle type. Okay, has what appears to be a clean tail, clean upper wing pattern on the secondary coverts. But the primary coverts and the primaries themselves show this extensive irregular patterning. And so we'll call this a fourth cycle type. American herring gull, Indiana, March, white-headed. The black on the bill tip is not unexpected at all in definitive adults, but it's the other features like the markings on the alula, the primary coverts here, and even the markings on the tail band. I think for a bird like this, I would just go advanced third cycle, although some of my friends would call this a fourth cycle type or just a third cycle. Again, some of the classifications are going to be subjective from individual to individual, but I think it's very safe to say we're not looking at an adult here. Laughing gull, Mexico, January, whitetail, kind of blown out here. This is overexposed, this whitetail here. You notice that. Important with gull ID when you compare these blacks and grays. If the white looks blown out here, you want to be careful with other features that you're interpreting. So laughing gull is a 3-cycle gull, and the tail and the secondaries, for the most part, look okay for an adult. But we're seeing a lot of brownish wash across the upper wing panel, these solid black centers to most of the primary coverts and even the alula here. I think it is perfectly fine to call this an advanced second cycle. Although it may be a third cycle, very well may be. I'm even seeing some dark on the secondary centers here, looking closely now. And so this could just be a very advanced, adult-looking second cycle laughing gull. Slatyback gull, California, March. Beautiful specimen, broad white trailing edge here, but I don't see a lot of the large string of pearls pattern that I'd like to see on P6, P7, P8. Could be age related. Here on the left wing, it looks a little bit better. But as for aging, the bill pattern, for one, looks very subadult-ish. The upper wing is showing extensive brown all across the upper wing. The scapulars appear to be a little more advanced, but the wing panels here are showing lots of brown wash. Markings on the tail. I would prefer to call a bird like this an advanced third cycle type. Whether it's a fourth cycle, again, is not anything I want to concern myself with right now without knowing life history, but I would call this an advanced third cycle. Lesser blackback gull, Florida, January, by and large, adult-ish, but notice these very small apicals. The extensive black on the bill, again, you can find that in definitive adults, but it catches my eye, and certainly when you zoom in on this bird, we see these black markings on the tail here. Let me just erase that. See those black markings on the tail. What I'm assuming is a mirror here for P10, and it looks significantly smaller than most definitive adults' P10 mirrors. And then finally, a really good feature to hone in on when you have birds perched like this are these primary coverts. So these primary coverts are solid black, although, again, we may find this in some definitive known-aged adults. Take all these features collectively, and I think it's safe to call this a advanced third cycle type. You notice with these birds, they'll have more brownish wash across the upper parts than a typical adult. Now, lesser blackbacks in general do show this fuscus, this brownish hue to their upper parts, but there's enough here on the outer greater coverts and some of these median coverts to suggest even the fact that this bird is not a definitive adult. With these birds, watch out for pinkish legs. They often do have pinkish legs, and the first thing people suspect is something more interesting, like a hybrid with American herring gull. Okay, but these third cycle types, even some fourth cycle types, may show a pinkish hue to the leg color. On the underwing, with some of these subadults, these fourth cycle types, you'll sometimes notice dark edging on the wing coverts, on the wing linings, on the underwing. So you'll see this dark edging, and again, you may find this in definitive adults, but it is just one supporting feature that you might suspect to see on a subadult. All right. Oftentimes, definitive adults will have snow white, just purely white wing linings. And in the subadult types, it's more expected that they would have this dark edging on the wing linings. Bonaparte's gull, we know, is is a two-cycle species, and for sure this bird is not a first cycle. Given the black spotting on the tail, black marks on the alula and primary coverts here, I think it is safe to call this a second cycle type. Iceland gull, Newfoundland, in December. The bill pattern is interesting. A lot of marbling on the tail. A lot of pigment on the secondaries and even the inner greater coverts here. I think it is perfectly fine to call this just a straight up third cycle Kumleen's gull. There's another Kumleen's, this one in Illinois in January. Unmarked tail, unmarked secondaries. The tail, the bill pattern looks a little interesting. Not the typical adult-like bill pattern. Usually when I see this bill pattern, it kind of prompts me to start looking at other things. It's one of my idiosyncrasies. I'll be scanning and I see these bill patterns, and then right away, all right, now I want to see the open wing on this bird. And sure enough, there's some wash here on the outer primary coverts that makes me think this is a fourth cycle type. Fourth cycle type. In flight from a distance, I'd probably call this an adult, right? Until we put it under the microscope and start looking for these features. California gull, white-headed here, interesting in March. A lot, if not most, adult types have these white heads, but they still retain a good amount of black on the bill, some even into June and through the breeding season, which is phenomenal. By and large, everything on this bird looks adult type except the tail pattern. There's enough pigment here to have me reserve this under fourth cycle type. If you look closely at the wing linings on the underside here, there is some dark edging around some of these wing coverts. And so I think that too supports the notion that we can call it a fourth cycle type. All right, so to conclude here, some features that you'll want to investigate if you are into obsessing over these little details with adult types or subadults. We said markings on the primary coverts, the number of marked primaries. So does the bird have markings on P4 when adults typically don't show markings on P4? The extent of pigment on the interwebs is a good example if you think back to that Vega gull. Tail markings, wing coverts have this brown wash, very suspicious looking subadult feature. The extent of markings on the lower neck and breast. Now, this isn't very reliable. A lot of adults show markings on the lower neck and breast, but it is just one other feature to help support what we're seeing. The wing linings, we said, with dark edging, and the bill pattern. Now, the bill pattern is not very reliable, but if you have like an Iceland gull with a very dull bill with blackish along the cutting edge and the tip, that is reason to investigate a little more with an open wing. So I think all of this, to conclude, should be taken with a grain of salt. It's important to conclude with that statement that these labels that we assign are simply estimates. They describe what we're seeing. In essence, it's a language we're using to unify our ideas, to unify this idea that we have an appearance that doesn't quite look like an adult, but we are by no means making any statements about biologically, does this bird breed? Biologically, how many years old is this bird? For that, you would need life history, and that usually comes in the form of a leg band, which unfortunately many of our North American gulls are not banded. And so perhaps this is an indirect request for my bird banding friends to band more gulls. All right, so that's going to conclude video 12. If you have any questions, comments, please include those in the comments down below, or just email to thegullguide@gmail.com. It has been a very busy 2 months for me, and so I do apologize to all my friends and associates who I have been neglecting, but I am behind on emails, and we'll get to those as the season progresses. Get out there, enjoy the rest of gull season. We still have a good solid 3 months to go before our northern friends take off and depart to the breeding grounds. Till next time, thanks again, and take care.